In these talks so far for Holy Week, we've been reflecting on how Holy Week, if we follow it in the right way, can open for us the spiritual dimension. And this morning I was talking about the spiritual dimension as the dimension that includes all the other dimensions of our lives. It's the dimension without boundaries, without divisions. Where the Spirit is, there is unity, St. Paul says. So anything in our life that unites, that heals, that integrates, could be said to be influenced by this energy of the spiritual dimension. Whatever divides, breaks, rejects, builds walls rather than bridges, could be said to deny this spiritual dimension. And if we want to live as spiritual people, of course we need to open the spiritual dimension within ourselves. It's not outside of ourselves only, nor is it only inside of ourselves. We are in this spiritual dimension. So, and I was saying that, of course, we continue to live in the world of duality, of contradictions, of oppositions. This is how we usually see the world, in terms of contrasting opposites. And when you have opposites, you often have conflicts, differences of opinion, differences of perception, differences of personality. So these oppositions also have to be accepted, because this dimension of duality is a real dimension. It's not the ultimate dimension, and we are not happy or healthy if we live only in this dimension of duality. That's why we need to open up the spiritual dimension. Nevertheless, it's something that we have to live with and learn how to live with. And to learn how to live with this dimension of duality and conflict and opposition, while at the same time discovering the spiritual dimension, that is what I'll talk about later as the life of a disciple. A disciple is someone who is learning to live in a different way, in a way that is oriented towards the spiritual dimension, but is also has, as it were, a way of functioning within the ordinary world, if you like. And that's why I gave you this little card of the picture of Christ from the icon at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. And I asked you to reflect on it, to look at it, and to allow this image to look at you. Were you able to do that?
Yes.
So, did you notice the two eyes, how different the two eyes are?
Yes.
Okay. And how would you describe the difference? What's the difference between them? First of all, just as you look at the face as a whole, what's the first impression you have? What's the first feeling you have of the face?
I've been drawn to that Christ's right eye, or left as you look at it, and what came to mind was, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
So that's your overall impression?
That was, yes, that, from that direction given
Yeah.
by that right eye.
But what I was asking was, looking at the picture as a whole, you just,
Yes.
you know, if you meet anybody, you start looking at their face, you begin to, first of all, one of the first things you will notice is that the eyes are different. We don't have symmetrical eyes. We would look, very few people have, anyway. So, but we get an impression of the person as a whole. What's your overall first impression? If you met somebody with this face, what would you think? What would you feel?
I get a sense of beauty.
Beauty. What kind of beauty?
Beauty, behavioural beauty.
Behavioural beauty.
You know, like an elegant way of moving in the world. But a beautiful way of moving in the world, yeah. A sense of peace that I find beautiful.
Good.
Something about the darkness of it says beauty to me as well. The dark hair and the dark eyes. Some kind of depth that is also beauty.
Good.
Not something that's not just surface based.
Thank you. Who can translate that? What you just said? Oh, you were translating. Sorry, you were translating. I didn't.
Fast, if you could slow down a bit, please.
Oh yes. So when you speak, if you wouldn't mind speaking a little more slowly. Mike, why are you making those faces?
I was just trying to do the half and half thing.
Oh, on there. I thought you were doing it.
Sorry.
Go on, Mike. Go on.
Oh, just when I opened my eyes, I also, my first word was beautiful, the first word.
Slowly.
And it's sorry, yeah. When I opened my eyes,
Lorsque j'ai ouvert les yeux,
the first word that came to mind
la première notion qui m'est venue à l'esprit, en
was
fait,
beautiful.
c'est
Beautiful.
très beau.
And it wasn't the eyes, it was the mouth, it was his, or the light, I would say, just the light.
C'était pas tant les yeux, en fait, la bouche rayonnée dans l'aspect.
The light.
The light.
The light. That
Light.
comes
La lumière.
La lumière qui rayonne, en fait, du visage.
Okay. Let's keep it. It's very good to get your responses, but keep them short because for the translator. Also, we didn't talk about the mouth. But let's leave the mouth till next year. But yes, the moustache is not c'est inégal. Eh? The moustache est inégal.
Ma première impression,
Yeah.
quand je l'ai vu ce matin,
The first impression I had this morning,
et je n'ai pas pu m'en détacher depuis, c'est qu'il y a un œil qui me regarde moi,
there's one eye that looks at
et
me,
l'autre qui regarde à travers moi, au-delà.
and the other eye looks across me or through me.
J'ai l'impression que l'œil qui est à gauche, l'œil de
Yes, the eye on the left
regarde une autre réalité qui est derrière moi ou en moi.
Okay, it looks at another reality that is behind me, behind the observer. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Marguerite? Sorrow. La tristesse. La douleur.
Moi, je vois la profondeur de quelqu'un qui a vécu quoi, qui sait ce que c'est que l'humanité, quoi. Je vois un regard profond qui connaît la souffrance, quoi.
So he knows suffering.
Mais la souffrance qui Voilà, c'est une souffrance qui transcende.
The suffering is transcended or transcends. Okay.
So, looking at the hands, on the right hand, it just seemed to be there without any grasping or anything, whereas the left hand, holding on to this scripture, to me it meant this was living a life of the rules and regulations. This was just being present, being.
Okay. Thank you. So, excellent.
Just one more word.
Yes, go on.
It's not, yeah, the mouth is important, but it's the smile. That's the first thing I saw.
Smile.
The figure is smiling.
Does everybody see the smile?
If
Yeah, Ruth?
if you cover a serious spot, the eye just isn't out. There is a twinkle in the other eye.
Okay.
Sad smile.
Just like some-
Okay, slowly. So, if you cover the dark eye, just
In this spot,
shh,
there
shh, shh.
is a twinkle in the eye and a smile.
Okay. Yes, you're quite right. There is. Yeah. It's Right. So it's an amazing portrait. Especially if you consider it was painted in the 5th century. Was it the 6th century? 6th century. So it's a astonishingly complete and comprehensive image of a human face. And this morning I was saying that the meaning of Christ in the light of Holy Week is that he shows us what humanity means, what it means to be human. We've often reduced Christianity to a morality, and we think of Jesus as somebody who's telling us what to do. In fact, the only thing he tells us to do is to love one another. He's the popular image of Christianity today in many parts of the world is of a very strict morality which condemns and rejects people who don't obey those moral codes. It's primarily seen as a moral filter. But this picture, I think, takes us back to the Jesus we meet in the Gospel, and to the risen Jesus that we meet in our hearts and in our community. And I think we've understood he's not telling us that we are wrong and that we should be better. He's not telling us what it is we should be doing, but he is awakening us to what he sees, to what he has already awakened to. Remember, he said to the disciples at the Last Supper, I call you friends because I have shared with you everything that I have learned from my Father. And these two eyes reflect the duality of life, that we live. It seems to me that the right eye here, the darker side of the face, is not condemning, but almost is carrying the cross of the world. He's seeing the suffering and darkness that there is in the world. He's seeing it in a way that moves him as it moves us when we see it, and moves us with many different kinds of response or emotion. Sadness, grief, maybe anger and outrage when we see injustice. So that's very, and there's that whole dimension of life in the world of duality, arising from conflict and division, is not denied, but it's absorbed, it seems to me, in the more dominant side of the face, which is the lighter face, the younger face as well, which is gazing us, as Jean-Claude said, is gazing into the spiritual dimension in us. That this other eye is looking into the spiritual dimension that is in us and is also beyond us. So, keep this card with you during the next 3 days of the Triduum, the 3 days of Easter, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Sunday was always seen as the 8th day of the week. So we've sort of opened up into the dimension beyond time on Sunday or the Sabbath. So tomorrow we will be beginning tomorrow evening with the washing of the feet. A very simple, dramatic, but friendly gesture of the spirit of service that the disciple of Jesus carries within them, tries to cultivate, and that defines the way we relate to each other, the spirit of service, not domination, not control, not some kind of superiority or inferiority, but the equality of friendship. If we want, Jesus, remember, says to his disciples that in his eyes he sees them as friends, he sees us as friends. And it's quite a revolutionary statement. If we believe or engage with the belief of the full meaning of the person of Jesus as the Word of God made incarnate in the flesh, in a human being, then we assume that everything that Jesus says and does then or now is a translation, a perfect translation of the divine into the human. Translation by its very nature is imperfect. But in the incarnation, we say that there is a perfect translation of the divine into the human. And therefore, what we see in Jesus is the Father. To see me is to have seen the Father, Jesus says. And of course, what enables that sight to happen is the Spirit. We can only see God, know God, by sharing in God's own self-knowledge. We can never know God as an object looking at or thinking about God from the outside. So if Jesus calls us his friends in this solemn, profound way, we could say this has revolutionized our understanding of our relationship to God. And because the nature of friendship is, one of the qualities of friendship in the human in human relationships is equality. You cannot be friends with someone unless you feel this equality. You could be colleagues, you could have all other sorts of complicated relationships, but if there's no recognition and acceptance of equality, there can't be friendship. I mean, you may admire your friend for the gifts that they have. You may see in them things that you don't have in yourself. But fundamentally, there has to be a meeting of equals. And of course, and in that meeting of equals, there is an exchange. I have revealed everything to you. This is what we do with a full friend. We share everything. We hold nothing back. So, this opens up a whole new sense of our relationship to God, and therefore to the ground of being, to our mysterious source of being. And of course it gives us a quite new understanding of our own nature. It means that in some sense, despite our human weakness and human failures, nevertheless, we are equal to God. If we weren't equal to God, it would be impossible for us to be divinized. And that the Christian mystical tradition emphasizes, that God became human so that the human being can become God. That's one of the theological mantras of the early church. God became human so that human beings might become God. So that doesn't mean that we have already arrived at this point, but it does give a meaning to life. The purpose of life is essentially to discover our capacity, our destiny to be divinized. And Jesus describes this in the passages we looked at yesterday in terms of union. That the union that he enjoys with the Father is the same union that he wishes us to enjoy with him. So, let's come back to this idea of discipleship. Tomorrow, as we begin Holy Thursday with the liturgy of the washing of the feet, we meet the disciples together with Jesus. He shocks Peter, the lead disciple, by saying that he will wash Peter's feet. Peter rejects this because he has not yet understood the nature of his relationship to Jesus. To be a disciple of Jesus is not just to be a follower or a worshipper, someone who worships. It is to be someone on the way to becoming one with Christ. To be a disciple is to be someone who is preparing for this ultimate consummation with the mind and the person of Christ. In fact, as the tradition used to say, we become another Christ. Another Christ. This is a lifelong journey, but it's one that gives meaning to everything in our life. It's not something we add on for consolation or for good luck, but we enter into it because it is the very essence of the meaning of our life. So what does it mean for us? And how can we become a Christian, or to be on our way to being a Christian? Who were the first disciples of the apostolic church? Because they model discipleship for every generation. We sort of look back to these early records and understand what it means to be a disciple of this teacher, this master. First of all, Jesus called them personally, one by one. They didn't all just register online, but there was a personal experience of a personal call. Some of them were fishermen, some of them tax collectors, political agitators. One of them was called a thief. He called them after an extended period of prayer on the mountain. After Peter was called from his boats, his fisherman boat on the Sea of Galilee, he moved and traveled around with Jesus. It was a change of life. Not everybody did that. There were different kinds of disciples. Some of the people Jesus healed followed him along the road. Some of them stayed at home but followed him in a different way. Above all, it's linked to prayer, to the experience of interior transformation. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, we see John the Baptist standing with two of his disciples when Jesus walks by. John points to Jesus and says, "There is the Lamb of God." And the two disciples follow Jesus. Now, just imagine the scene. They're following him. What are they looking at? What are they looking at when they follow him? What are they looking at? Right. So, and then it says he turns. So, they're following him, being good Christians. They go to church. They obey most of the commandments. And then he turns and he sees them following him. So, he's now looking at them, right? What happens at that moment? He talks. Yep. He said, "What are you looking for?" His first spoken words to them is a question. It's a very simple question, but quite a dramatic question, because how do you answer that question? If we were to say, what are you looking for by coming to Bonnevaux this Easter? Quickly, hurry up, what are you looking for? It would be difficult to give us a straight answer. Are we going okay? So the disciples respond, and they respond, "Master." Because their first word to him is an acknowledgement of what they have already learned, not from John the Baptist, but from his look at them, the way he looked at them. And in many other places in the story, in the Gospels, Jesus looks at people. He looked at the rich young man who found it difficult to give up his attachments to his wealth. And he loved him. And in the story of the Passion narrative, when he's during his trial, Jesus looks at Peter after Peter has denied him the third time. What kind of look is that? So, a look, a simple gaze, regard, can bring about quite a powerful change in the person who is receiving that look. So they say, "Master." And then they ask him a question. It's a different kind of question. It's a disciple's question. They say, "Master, where are you staying?" And this word "staying" is a very ambiguous word, because in the Gospel of John, it also is used in the later passages that we've looked at from the Last Supper, when Jesus says, as we looked at this morning, "The Father and I will come and make our home in you." So we will come and stay in you, with you. So imagine you get a message from a friend, "I'm coming to stay." I don't know for how long, but I'm coming to stay. But it could also mean, what's your address? What hotel are you staying at in Capernaum? Jesus moved from Nazareth, which was a little small town or village, off the beaten track, remote, and he moved to Capernaum at the beginning of his teaching and traveling. It was his base of operation, because Capernaum was a very well-connected city on the main communication routes. So it was there probably that he stayed, and maybe in Peter's house, by legend. Anyway, so we could also call Jesus Jesus of Capernaum as well as Jesus of Nazareth. So the disciples ask him, "Where are you staying?" And he replies, "Come and see." So he doesn't give them a direct answer. I'm staying the third house past the gas station. But he gives them an invitation. And they accept this invitation. They go and they see where he is staying, and they stay with him, the same word, stay with him for the rest of the day. So the day is a symbol of a life, perhaps. And then St. John ends this little passage by saying it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Actually, it's 5 o'clock. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Tea time. But also a time of prayer for the early Christians. The early church punctuated the day like the Muslims do, or we do here in Bonnevaux. At certain times of the day, we'll be meditating at 6 o'clock. So if you were to say to somebody at Bonnevaux, it was about 6 o'clock, if you knew the place, you'd know that's meditation time. So this is prayer. So the whole of this story is very, very economical, simple story describing the first moments of discipleship, but symbolizing maybe a whole lifetime of discipleship. So the whole of this is connected to the moment of prayer, to the experience of prayer. Not just of action, not just of preaching. Later, Jesus sends them out, 2 by 2, on little missions to preach, to heal, to proclaim the good news. But the deeper grounding of this mission is prayer. And prayer is entering into this presence, the staying of Christ in us. So he called the first disciples apostles. The word means messenger or maybe ambassador. They were not sophisticated or educated people. And some of them came from rather unpopular professions, like being a tax collector. Not the most popular profession ever, but particularly unpopular then because the tax collectors were known to be very corrupt. So they entered into a new lifestyle as they followed him and began to be disciples. And they failed frequently, perhaps continuously. Peter was the biggest failure of them all. But Jesus was always faithful to them. He never sent anybody away. Even Judas. He doesn't reject Judas. He had 3 close disciples, Peter, James, and John, who accompany him at special moments. Then we should also add St. Paul, who calls himself and insists that he is an apostle just as much as Peter and Matthew and the others. Because he said he also met Christ on the road. He also was called and followed. He met the risen Christ, which is how we meet him, not the historical Jesus, but the risen Christ. So we also in a sense, have this call to be apostles, messengers, and ambassadors. That comes with it. That comes with a responsibility, in other words. It's not just the privileges of being a disciple, but it comes with responsibilities. So what is involved in being a disciple? Well, it's not so much what are the conditions, because as we see, we may not fulfill the conditions very well. But what is involved? What would lead us into this new identity? And it is a kind of a reshaping of our identity. First of all, a love of Jesus, an attraction. And you fall in love with someone maybe over time or maybe at first sight, but even if it's at first sight, it has to grow and develop. And there's no real logical, rational reason that you can give for that attraction. It's just there. So that must be the basic element. But then also a trust in his authenticity, which allows us to obey his teaching, to listen to his teaching as best we can. And above all, to keep walking with him. Jesus says, "No one can be my disciple without renouncing all his possessions." Well, St. Francis of Assisi interpreted that literally. St. Benedict interprets it communally. Not just individually giving away everything you have, but more in the spirit of sharing and using what you have for the common good. So however you interpret it, and St. Francis had a good interpretation, though not many people can reproduce that, but St. Benedict also had a perfectly and perhaps more realistic interpretation of what it means to leave all your possessions behind. John Main, as we heard in the reading at lunch today, understood meditation in the Christian tradition as a way of living that call to renounce all your possessions. Not, first of all, in the external or material sense, but interiorly. This is precisely what we do as we say the mantra. We are letting go, renouncing all the riches of thought and imagination, as one of the teachers of St. Benedict said. And when we meditate wholeheartedly, we are embracing the way of poverty, just as radically as St. Francis of Assisi. He also calls his disciples to non-violence, recognizing that it is not easy to practice, and as Gandhi said, it takes more courage to be non-violent than to respond with violence. So even though we may fail to practice this principle of non-violence in all situations, nevertheless, we engage with it It's something that we believe in. He also clearly cares for the poor, for the marginal, for the weak, rather than identifying himself with the centers of power or individuals of power. He identifies with those on the ground level. So there are many other elements of Christian discipleship that we can identify from the gospel stories. The early church, it seems, was composed mostly of domestic slaves, a rather low-class kind of church. When I was visiting Mike's sister, who's a priest Anglican priest in Boston, at a church where she runs a group for homeless people, meditation group for homeless people. And when she became a priest, she felt called not so much to be in the church building as to be with the people in the on the streets, many of whom are homeless, alcoholic, drug addicts. And she formed a little community with them. And so they used to come, and she would meditate with them, and I meditated with them, and a very deep and profound meditation with these street people. While I was with them, one of the priests of the church came to visit, and he told me that he said when he first came to the church, he was given the job of building up the congregation, bringing more people into the church. And when he arrived early one morning for the first day, he saw all these street people sitting on the steps of the church, waiting for their sandwich or their cup of coffee. And he said, the first thing that came through to my mind was, well, if we're going to bring new people to the church, we have to get rid of this lot. Who's going to come into the church? People like me, or people like us, if we have to step over this kind of part of the population. And he said that it was only when he met this group of homeless people who came regularly for the meditation group and realized what a profound presence of Christ there was at those meetings. He said, then it clicked. He said, these are the people. I'm supposed to bring new people into the church. Well, here they are. Let's welcome them. Let's say that we welcome you, and maybe it would be nice if we had some rich benefactors as well, but we're not going to send you away in order to please the rich benefactors. So this is clearly essential to Christian discipleship. That if we have a preference or an option, we can be open to everyone, condemn no one. But if there is a preference, it is strongly towards the poor and the marginal. So this early period of discipleship came to an end when the church became established when the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century said, let's use this Christian church, which is now spread all around the empire. The empire is in trouble. Maybe we can use this group to advance the unity and good organization in the empire. And this led to a dramatic change in the numbers, but also in the quality of disciples. There was an obvious decline in the spiritual energy or the spiritual intensity. Christian life became more ritualistic or more let's say superficial. Soon after that, the monastic movement began, another form of discipleship. It began in the deserts of Egypt in the 4th century. And it was from this movement of Christian contemplative renewal, of people living a very radical kind of discipleship. It was directly from this desert tradition that we receive the teaching of meditation that has led us here to Bonnevaux and is, the life and the mission of the world community. So perhaps we could say that we are at a new phase of Christian discipleship. It's one, and we are in transition from what is left of the old institutional forms of Christianity. We know that those forms are changing before our eyes or disappearing. Religious orders disappearing, plummeting, declining numbers of clergy, alienation of most of the younger population and many women. So we can see we are in a time of dramatic change. I don't think it's a time of extinction, as some people predict. But I think we could say it's a time of transformation, a recovery of this essence of discipleship. In the contemporary context. Two elements that I think many of us would see in the form of the new church that is taking shape. Well, first of all, that it will be a church of many forms. It will be a more diverse, less monolithic kind of fellowship. Secondly, that although there will no doubt be clergy and monks, every religion generates some form of monastic life and has need of some kind of ministry. But the forms of clergy and monastic life will no doubt be very different from what we have been familiar with. And it will be contemplative. One of the great theologians of the 20th century, Karl Rahner, said that the Christian of the future will be mystic, or there will be no Christians. So, more diversity and a deeper contemplative spirituality and more engagement with the world, the real world around us. So, that's all I have to say about disciples for this evening, anyway.